hunted by legends of the storyteller. The rasping breath tore at his throat, each inhale a burning reminder of the terror nipping at his heels. He didn't know what was chasing him. He only knew the primal dread that coiled in his gut, the icy fingers of fear that gripped his heart. It was formless, shapeless, yet undeniably there, a presence that thrummed in the very air around him. The trees blurred into a green-brown tunnel, branches clawing at his clothes like skeletal fingers. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Nothing, just the deepening twilight. But the feeling persisted, a cold sweat blooming on his brow. He swore he saw shadows flicker at the edges of his vision, grotesque figures contorting and shifting behind the trees. A hunched figure with impossibly long arms, a face that was all gaping maw, a slithering, serpentine form that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Were they real, or figments of his panicked mind? He couldn't tell, and the uncertainty was a torment in itself. His lungs screamed for air, but he dared not stop. He stumbled, his foot catching on a gnarled root. He went down hard, the breath knocked from his body. For a moment, the world swam in a dizzying kaleidoscope of green and brown. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline surging through him, a desperate surge of energy fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. He burst through the trees and onto the bank of a river. It snaked through the landscape, a ribbon of dark water reflecting the bruised purple sky. He didn't hesitate. He plunged in, the icy shock of the water stealing his breath. He thrashed through the current, the cold a welcome distraction from the fear that gnawed at him. He reached the other side, collapsing onto the muddy bank, his body trembling uncontrollably. He looked back at the trees, expecting to see something, but there was nothing, just the silent, watchful woods. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, trying to catch his breath, trying to still the frantic beating of his heart. The silence was unnerving. It pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. He felt exposed, vulnerable. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever was chasing him was still out there, waiting. He pushed himself to his feet, his muscles aching, his mind reeling. He had to get away. He had to find somewhere safe. But where? Nowhere felt safe. The world had become a place of lurking shadows, a place where the unseen hunted in the twilight. As he started to run again, he noticed something new. Small, almost imperceptible, ripples in the dark water of the river. They weren't moving against the current, but with it, and they were getting closer. A cold dread washed over him, colder than the river he had just crossed. He stared into the water, and his own reflection stared back. But behind his reflection, something else began to materialize. Something vast. Something that made the shadows in the trees seem like child's play. The ripples quickened, converging on his location, and then the water began to boil. He could feel the ground trembling. He wanted to scream, but his vocal cords were frozen with terror. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into a vortex of darkness and swirling water was his own terrified face, reflected in the monstrous rising form that had emerged from the depths. And then nothing. Just the sound of rushing water. And then nothing. Just the sound of rushing water. His eyes snapped open. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room assaulted his senses. The rhythmic beeping of a machine filled the air, a stark contrast to the roaring water of his nightmare. He was lying in a bed, his arm hooked up to an IV drip. His heart was still pounding, his breath ragged. He looked around the sterile room, the pale green walls, medical equipment, the clock ticking slowly on the wall. It was real. He was safe, or at least safer. A nurse entered, her face etched with concern.
Mr. Evans, you're awake? How are you feeling?
He tried to speak, but his throat was dry and scratchy. Water, he croaked. She gave him a small cup of water, which he drank gratefully.
You gave us quite a scare,
She said.
You were brought in unconscious. Apparently, you were found wandering in the woods, muttering about something chasing you.
He stared at her, his mind still reeling from the dream. Chasing me, he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth.
Yes.
The nurse replied.
Do you remember anything?
He shook his head. The images of the shadowy figures, the twisting trees, the dark river flashing through his mind. Just a dream, he said, his voice barely a whisper. A terrible dream. The nurse smiled gently.
It's understandable. You've been under a lot of stress lately. The doctor said you've been pushing yourself too hard.
He closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. He remembered now. The long hours at work, the pressure to succeed, the constant feeling of being overwhelmed. He had been running, not from some unknown entity in a dream, but from the crushing weight of his own life. The woods, the shadows, the river, they were all metaphors, projections of his own anxieties, his own fears. The monstrous form in the water. That was him, or rather, the part of him he was trying to escape, the part consumed by stress and fear. He looked at the nurse, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Thank you, he said, for everything. He knew he still had a long way to go. He knew the anxieties wouldn't just disappear, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had faced his fears in his dream, and though it was terrifying, he had survived. And maybe, just maybe, that meant he could face them in real life too. He drifted back to sleep, the image of the dark river still lingering in his mind. But this time, it didn't feel quite so terrifying. It felt familiar, like a part of himself he finally understood.